Everyone to the CASN Lunch and Learn series. My name is Sithokoz Lemaphosa, and I'm an assistant professor with the University of Saskatchewan. And I have the honor today to host this meeting. I would like to welcome you to this Lunch and Learn, and it is presented by CASN Research and Scholarship Committee. The presentation in this series is focusing on cutting-edge leadership that creates change. And today we are focusing on how do we create change when we have to address cultural contradictions that are associated with interconnectedness, especially in relation to male sexual health. I would like to start with the land acknowledgement. CASN's national office is located on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people, and would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region and in all regions across Canada. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. I am talking to you from Treaty 6. Lunch and Learns are a popular tool in academia to encourage scholarship. Faculty members come together during their lunch hours to share their work and to network. CASN's webinar series presented by the Research and Scholarship Committee aims to recreate the collegial feel of the Lunch and Learn and is intended to serve as an inspiration and a networking opportunity. Nursing faculty from across the country present on a scholarship project, and they discuss methodologies, successes, or challenges they've encountered in their work. We'll be recording today's session, beginning with a presentation from our speakers, and will include a 15 to 20 minutes of questions and answers after the presentation. To submit a question, please use the chat function, and please note that CASN does not distribute the PowerPoint presentations. In this session, we'll hear from Dr. Sue O'Donnelly from the University of New Brunswick. We'd like to welcome Sue again, whose presentation is entitled Leadership in Identifying and Addressing Contradictions Associated with the Interconnectedness of Violence and Gender for Boys and Women. Dr. O'Donnelly, thank you. We look forward to your presentation. Over to you, Sue.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Thank you, Sitozo. So I too would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that where I'm situated here at the University of New Brunswick stands on the unsurrendered and unceded territory of the Wolastoqey land. These are the lands of the Wabanaki people, which are recognized here in a series of peace and friendship treaties that were meant to establish an ongoing relationship of peace, friendship, and mutual respect between equal nations. The Wolastoq, or the river that runs by our beautiful campus and this beautiful river, along which live the people of the beautiful and bountiful river, is also called the St. John River. And we have the wonderful privilege of having a beautiful view of this river from our campus. So it is with that I would like to thank the Canadian Association of Schools of Nursing for the invitation to present today, and to talk about leadership in identifying and addressing contradictions associated with the connectedness or the interconnectedness of violence and gender for boys and men. And I think at this point in history, this is a topic that we all ought to be concerned with, and that we certainly do need leadership around. So just to share a little bit about myself, I am an associate professor and currently serving as the Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies here at the University of Nursing, or University of New Brunswick Faculty of Nursing. My research interests and background have broadly include violence, gender, and health. And more recently, over the past 10 years or so, in the context of work with both my own individual research, but also within the context of our broader team, I've been particularly interested in understanding the role of gender and its link with men's violence, really as an approach to ending violence. So I want to acknowledge and share with you here the names and photos of the wonderful members of my team. And these include, I guess, from top left to right, myself, Dr. Kelly Scott Story, Dr. Judith Wiest, Dr. Patria Taylor, Dr. Charlene Vincent, who is our one of our research assistants, and our research manager, Jeannie Malcolm. So together, this team has worked together for a number of years, beginning with many of us working with Dr. Judith Wiest. Some of you on the call may know her for her grounded theory and violence work, to now working alongside of one another as colleagues. Our research has been funded by the Canadian Institution of Health Research, or the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, as well as Research New Brunswick. So it's important to note and acknowledge the funding that we've received to do this important work. I want to say that although my work and the discussion today is focused on the experiences of violence among boys and men, and particularly men from research that we've done, members of our research team that I've just introduced you to now have a very long and significant history of examining and addressing women's experiences of violence. And this is through examples of CIHR, Public Health Agency of Canada, WAGE, and other funded studies that have included a focus on the health effects of intimate partner violence for women, a health intervention for women who've experienced intimate partner violence, looking at measurement for intimate partner violence for women and other individuals, as well as looking at women's experiences of workplace bullying, as well as the link between violence and suicidality. So individually and collectively, we have done a significant amount of work with women, examining their experiences of violence and the impact that it has in their lives. And we certainly know, based on that work, that women are most often targets of violence that is perpetrated by men. We do also know, however, that men can be targets of violence. But what we've learned from this work, which really started out for all of us, looking at women's experiences, is that to truly address and end violence for women and girls, we need to look at men's experiences. This is a critical part of the solution toward ending violence for all individuals. And so this does, and I think really for us as a team, is what shifted our attention and focus toward looking at violence and men's experiences. And in particular, that critical examination of the complex relationship between gender and violence for men. And in my work and role, and what I bring to the team, is that focus on and interest in a gender lens for examining violence. So, rather than moving through a literature review to set the context for the work that we're doing, I did want to ask to engage our audience. And so if those of you who are on the call could have a look at this prompt, which is, beginning to think about what gender means. Gender has been defined in a number of ways, but there is common agreement that gender is a social construct. And so I'd be interested in hearing from you, what does this mean to you when you hear that gender is a social construct? So you can just use the chat to answer that question. And I'll give you a couple minutes for that. So I'm hearing from Rachel that it relates to social norms, expectations, and rules. Wonderful. Anyone else? Learned experiences, says Craig. Wonderful, yes. And we're going to talk about the recent Texas bill. Thank you. So that social context influences our experience of gender. An individual perception of their gender fits with the social, temporal, cultural expectations they are surrounded by Jeannie. Excellent, thank you. Or Jenny, sorry. So those of you who are on the call who felt brave enough to share their experiences and their knowledge of gender or their perceptions of what gender as a social construct is, I think really, certainly define it in ways that are commonly described. So we know that gender is not binary, meaning, we've moved away from this understanding of the male-female binary or a masculine-feminine binary. Rather, it's a much more fluid construct that really ranges from various demonstrations and expressions of gender. I think as someone else had just said that maybe it was Jenny, gender really is negotiated and defined in relation to one's surroundings and in relation to others. So we know it's a relational construct. And so this really means that how one constructs and expresses their gender is shaped by their surroundings or that social, cultural, and historical context of their lives. So that's an important thing to think about as we consider, our current social context and norms and how they might influence the ways boys and men see themselves in those roles. So then, if gender is a social construct shaped by social, cultural, and historical contexts, in what ways do you think our current Western social context might influence what it means to be a boy or man? And you can turn on your audio feature if you want to speak up and share a response, or you can feel free to use the chat. I think Sadosal, the comment that you made around the recent Texas bill, that is a context in which we currently exist that may influence people's experiences and how their view of themselves and their view of their own gender is shaped. So these are just some headlines when I typed in gender and masculinity that came up. And so this reflects then some factors within our social realm that can influence the ways individuals see themselves, or in the very least, those factors that contribute to pressures for individuals to enact their gender in particular ways. And so there are other ways. This certainly reflects one very dominant approach to understanding gender and masculinity. But certainly, I think we have seen a resurgence, or certainly more attention and focus around a particular approach to expressions of what it means to be a man in recent months. And so I think these are things that we need to pay attention to, and it brings us back to that topic of the role that leadership can play in counteracting some of these messages. So we talked about gender as a social construct, and we know then that gender is enacted in relation to one's surroundings. We also know from the literature and theories of gender that dominant or more traditional forms of masculinity have been linked to harms for boys and men as well as others. So I'm interested in hearing from you what your thoughts are on the ways that expressions of gender might link to more traditional forms of masculinity and could result in harm. So what are some of those more traditional expressions of masculinity that you think could result in harm? I'll give you a few minutes to see if anyone wants to answer. I think that's a great point that you make there, Sadoko, that traditional Western values may differ from non-Western traditions, or there may be similarities. And so we know that, across the world, that ways in which individuals enact gender certainly varies. And I think this reflects that idea that gender is a fluid social construct that is influenced by social, but also cultural contexts. So in the Western context, in particular, and North American context, as Craig has said here, things like the acceptance of violence in sport may be an example of a norm. So what we can say about this is we know that variations in constructions and expression of gender exist. So those images that I shared reflects one way that individuals construct and express or think about gender. But we do also know that in Western society, harmful views about what it means to be a man or a boy certainly do continue to exist. Statements like boys will be boys or man up, these continue to be common and reflect the persistence of traditional gender norms and expectations. And so this includes views that boys and men ought to be strong, that they ought to be tough, independent, aggressive, stoic, that they ought to be able to defend themselves and others, and that they ought to use violence, in fact. So this leads us then to thinking about the connection between gender and violence, and in particular, our interest as a research team. So based on our work over time and looking at the literature around women's experiences, but also men or individuals more broadly than that even, we know that violence experience, particularly for individuals who identify as men, is very pervasive. And it's not just pervasive at a particular point in time, rather that we know that men and boys experience violence in many contexts throughout their lifespan. And these contexts include things like experiencing violence within families, within relationships, at school, within teams, groups, workplaces, and communities. We also know that despite this pervasiveness of experiences of violence for boys and men, research really has tended to focus on a particular type of violence. So, for example, dating violence or maybe childhood violence at a particular point in time. And it has tended to look at violence experienced either as a perpetrator or a target. Less attention has been paid to the persistent and co-occurring experiences of violence across the lifespan that we know individuals experience, including men. And so it's important to look at that as well as the associated cumulative impact on health and well-being, because we know, for men and individuals in general, they may experience and often do many forms of violence across their lifespan. So this is something that our team has been very interested in and began to investigate based on our sort of understanding that there is this persistent lifetime violence experience for men, and yet our theoretical understanding doesn't really align with measurement. So to address these shortcomings, beginning almost 10 years ago now, we developed a measure of cumulative lifetime violence severity. And the intention of this measure was to capture both frequency and severity so that we can get at the chronic stress response and that allostatic overload that we know is associated with chronic and persistent experience of violence. In a measure that also looked at physical, psychological, and sexual violence, both as target and perpetrator from childhood through to adulthood in a range of contexts. So it's a very broad and comprehensive measure. We've been working to refine and revise the measure over time. And as you can see on this slide, there's a number of papers and publications related to the measure that you can certainly feel free to have a look at. And they are listed at the end of the talk as well. So in addition to, recognizing this need to look at and try and measure cumulative lifetime violence for men, we also recognize the need to talk to men about their experience of violence across their lifetime. So in doing this, we've done a lot of mixed methods work over time. We're currently doing a longitudinal study, but to begin, this mixed methods study, which is being discussed today, or the study I will discuss today, is a part of a larger mixed method study that focused on understanding the links between violence, gender, and health for men. This included then both a quantitative and qualitative component. In our quantitative component, we conducted survey research testing out our cumulative lifetime violence severity measure with a community convenience sample of men who were invited to complete a survey. Of course, it also included other measures of health and some social determinants of health. Interestingly, we, in this community convenience sample, or importantly, I should say, men did not have to have violence experience to take part. And what we found overall is that men were interested in completing this survey, and our initial sample with this particular study was of 685 Atlantic Canadian men. We've since tested the measure on national samples of men, and like I said, those papers are available for you to have a look at. But today I'd like to talk about findings from our qualitative project associated with this study, where we purposefully sampled individuals from this larger quantitative study based on characteristics of interest, including that they have had cumulative lifetime violence experience. And we used interpretive description to inform our design, including data collection and analysis. So this qualitative study will be the focus of the discussion today, and really is what led us to looking at this connectedness between violence and gender for men. So the purpose of this particular study was then to examine the complex relationship between gender and violence among those who identify as men and have cumulative lifetime violence histories. Additional objectives beyond meeting with men and talking to them about that relationship were to understand what it means to be a man from their perspective, and to also understand their perspective on experiences of cumulative lifetime violence. So the study sample that will inform the discussion and the findings certainly that will be presented today is based on a total of 32 men who met with us either in person or on the phone or online to talk about their experiences. Most of the individuals, and so we did purposefully want to talk to individuals with cumulative lifetime violence experience, and most did have CLV experience. You can see here that the majority of the sample as both target and perpetrator. So this aligns with our broader quantitative sample, where most also identified having experiences of both violence as a perpetrator and a target. So this is an important finding and contribution to our understanding of cumulative lifetime violence, which is that, violence is complex, and that many individuals have, particularly men, experiences as both a perpetrator and a target. And, if we go back to that statement around the pervasiveness of violence in men's lives, including, within schools, teams, communities, and families, and so on, this is perhaps not surprising. The other thing I wanted to say is that we did invite anyone from the larger study who had violence experience to be a participant in this research. And so while most had experience as target or perpetrator, there were some that identified as being a target only, but there was no one who participated that identified as being only a perpetrator. And I can, again, you can have a look at the paper to get more information about detailed demographics. But for the purpose of this work and the time today, I will exclude some of those details. So when we think about the overall objectives of our research and what we found, we were interested in understanding how men defined violence. And we know from our own research over time that the terms violence and abuse are often used interchangeably by individuals, and that men often equate the term violence with physical violence. And so for that reason, we purposefully used the words violence and abuse throughout our interviews. And we did sort of set the stage for our discussion around men's experiences of cumulative lifetime violence by offering a broad description of violence and a clarifying statement to suggest that violence includes not only physical violence or abuse, but emotional and other types of abuse that have occurred in the family, workplace, community, or partner relationships. Interestingly, when we asked men about experiences of violence, they initially discussed and equated violence with or as physical violence. So this is inconsistent with many of our studies over time. So it does, I think, reinforce the need to define violence broadly and to define it clearly for participants in studies like this. With further probing, however, men did discuss and describe experiences of other forms of violence, including emotional and sexual violence, as both a target and/or perpetrator. And what we learned from talking to men about how they define violence is certainly that their experiences that occurred across the lifespan did occur in a variety of settings or contexts, including their homes, their schools, their communities, and their workplaces. And then, in thinking about how men defined it, what would be sort of a definition from their perspective, men describe violence as actions that threaten to or actually cause harm to another person, object, or themselves. They also discuss the consequences of violence for themselves and others, which included physical, emotional, and social harm. And so, what we found from, or an important finding from this is that men were willing to talk about their violence experience with us, despite maybe some misconceptions that men may be less interested in or talking about topics like this. So we also wanted to understand, how men understood and defined what it meant to be a man. When asked to talk about this as a part of our interview guide, men tended to respond with ease, but initially they tended to talk about gender in general, not about, how they define what it means to be a man, for example, for themselves. So this was reflected in descriptions of what we might define as more stereotypical or traditional masculine characteristics, like being heroic, macho, strong, tough, dominant, assertive, confident, stoic, and calm. So this is how men kind of readily described what it means to be a man in our current context, but they weren't really talking about themselves. They also talked about behaviors including being a provider, helping people, enjoying sports, not sharing their emotions, not seeking help for problems, and being in control. So, we did have difficulty getting men to talk about their own gender. And so as a team, we reflected on this and thought about, is it the language we're using in our interview guide? So we did, when we asked them to define what it means to be a man or to talk about what gender means for them, we found that there were pauses in the interviews that men might ask for clarification, or they did ask for clarification or were having difficulty answering. So we changed our interview guide and asked them additional different questions like, can you tell me about any experiences where what was expected of you was different than how you wish to be as a man? We did find that some of these amendments were useful and that men were able to reflect on and discuss gender in a more robust way. What was very interesting is that although some men had difficulty defining their view of themselves as men, their thoughts and expressions of gender were very evident throughout our entire interviews. We learned that men's understanding and expression of gender was very complex, it was nuanced, and that it did shift in various contexts over time. And so this does reflect what we know about gender as being a social construct. So one man noted, for example, when I was younger, I used to think the badder and tougher you were, the cooler you were, but it didn't work out. I ended up in prison. At this point in my life, I'm not really concerned with that anymore. I've got a kid coming and now I'm calm, but don't push me too far, I guess. I still have that in me somewhere, but far down there. I'm more interested in my family at this point. So as this quote, highlights, and we saw in many anecdotes across various participants, is that what it means to be a man really, it changed over time for men. And I think that aligns with this idea of gender being fluid. So another very interesting and important finding from this study is that despite kind of this variation and fluctuation in how participants define and express themselves as men over time, descriptions and gender and masculinity were consistently linked to violence. So violence was embedded in thoughts, definitions, and expressions of what it means to be a man. And it was illuminated or highlighted as a way of demonstrating what it means to be a man. So for us, this really emerged as a central theme, and this kind of overarching or broader link between violence and gender, or gender and masculinity and violence, emerged as a theme that we called masculinity, violence, interconnectedness, or what we often have been referring to as a team, and I'll use the language for the presentation as MV interconnectedness. So throughout the presentation, I've kind of highlighted what we see as key or important findings in red here, you'll notice. And an interesting finding, or an important one, is that gender and masculinity, we found, are linked to violence in ways that not only informed participant views about what it means to be a man, but also their experience and use of violence. And the interconnectedness, as I described, represents this complex relationship between gender and violence, a connection that we learned is very difficult to separate because of persistent normalization and acceptance of violence among boys and men. So if we go back to some of those headlines, it may seem somewhat sensationalist at this point in time, but in reality, that context that individuals are continually exposed to does make it difficult for people to express themselves in ways that don't align with dominant views. And we certainly learned this from our study. We also learned that the connectedness between gender and violence for men contributes to reward for them as well as harm. Interestingly, because this connection is strong, even among those who resisted and wanted to disconnect violence from their sense of self, views about gender and what it means to be a man, so these broader social views, contributed to pressure for these men and boys to act in a particular way, and that included acting using violence. And I'll share examples of that as we move along. There is a tension that arises, though, when men contemplate this link between violence and gender and the related benefits of harm. And in particular, and especially, I guess, there's desire to separate violence from how they define themselves as men. So this tension between, wanting to express themselves in a particular way and then the pressures to enact gender that exist in society was contributing to this tension that we called a gender paradox, or an masculinity's violence paradox, I should say. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about this normalization and acceptance of violence that contributes to this MV interconnectedness. So what we found from our research is that our discussion with men who had histories of cumulative lifetime violence revealed that normalization of violence begins at a very young age and persists throughout their lifespan. Some individuals discuss violence, for example, in the family home, where role models, including fathers, controlled the environment with physical or emotional abuse. And these kinds of experiences informed ideas about the role of men in relationships, in homes, and in communities. And we must importantly note, however, that some men, sort of modeled and took up these ways of being that they saw in others, but some others also actively resisted this. Many who discussed childhood family violence in the home also spoke of violence in either their neighborhood or community settings, where it was used to either attain recognition or even maintain social order and status in peer groups. We found that social expectations that men ought to defend those who are vulnerable, or that they feel somewhat responsible for others, do contribute to this ongoing normalization, whereby actions are viewed as necessary for doing the right thing and taking up the role of being a boy or man. So, you know, the idea is that things are necessary and they're feeling this pressure is what contributes to that connectedness between violence and gender for men and boys. So as I mentioned before, in this context where, you know, the link between violence and gender is normalized and in fact accepted, this interconnectedness, we know, can generate reward for men and contribute to their sense of self. So an example of that is we saw that maintaining masculine status by way of violence was evident as individuals described their own or others' effort to demonstrate toughness via things like physical altercations with other boys and men to exhibit strength. And also as a way of maintaining status or earning status. So one person says here, I think going through the whole broken jaw stuff, it really helped with my street cred. While in high school, it made a lot of people not mess with me sort of thing, which was helpful. So, you know, that helpful being associated with reward. Someone else said, I did get bullied when I was at the beginning of grade school, partially because I was smaller. But then I befriended someone who was quite large, so that helped. And eventually I ended up fighting back against the bullies, and that kind of stopped it. It did lead to me obviously becoming violent toward other people, but in the end, it did prevent further abuse, I suppose. So you can see how the use of violence here contributes to reward for men that justifies its use. Normalization and acceptance of violence was also evidence in workplaces, and this was particularly common among, you know, individuals that worked in roles like security, military, or law enforcement, where use of violence is considered to be a part of the role. So one person said, other than what I've been ordered to do, I've been pretty nonviolent. I haven't had a violent past of any serious consequence other than my military service. In these roles, it was acceptable to use physical violence as a means of providing protection and maintaining order and control. The use of violence was unquestioned and in fact expected, as one individual noted, well, it was controlled violence because I was in security and law enforcement, and I could justify using violence just by like the job, you know. So another important thing to be considering here is that the connectedness between gender and violence and the related norms and expectations with someone had mentioned earlier do influence the ways that not only men identify and define violence, but also how others do. So we can see, for example, among men in this sample who experienced dating or partner violence with women, there were some assumptions that men ought not to be victims. So we see men as perpetrators and not victims, which then results in further assumptions and expectations and judgment around you know, what it means to be a man. And so this left some individuals questioning their masculinity and how to handle circumstances. This was reflected in expressions of, based on their victimization, weakness and shame, worries that others might not believe them, and concerns about lack of resources to address the violence. So in this instance, we see that connection between masculinities and violence, or the MV interconnectedness, as men as perpetrators, not victims. And that link between gender and violence can limit men's potential to both identify that they've been a target of violence, but to also reach out to others and articulate that experience and try to seek help. We can also see how this link and assumptions about gender and violence and that discomfort with the idea of men as targets or victims results in others experiencing difficulty helping or even acknowledging men's or boys' experience of violence. So, for example, one person identified that his uncle asked if he was being bullied by his girlfriend. He didn't feel comfortable coming out and talking to him about his experience as being violence and labeling it as that. Another person highlighted feelings of discord or, feeling perplexed and uncertain about how to proceed with their experience or addressing their experience when they had experienced partner violence in a society where men are seen as head of the household. This left him feeling as though he should be able to manage this experience on his own, and that was his role to be able to deal with it. So As mentioned, there are benefits, but there are also harms to this connection between MV interconnectedness. And when I say benefits, I'm talking about perceived benefits like, men not getting further bullied in schools or earning street cred and so on. But we know ultimately violence of all types and forms results in harm. So men talked about the ways that using violence and experiencing violence contributed to physical, emotional, and social consequences or harm. And these included impacts such as trauma, damaged relationships, difficulties in the workplace, and incarceration for men. As one man explained, at the time it never bothered me because I was trying to be manly, tough, ridiculous swagger. But, after sobriety, I started looking at these things. And I remember at one point, it was a domination to bend someone to my will. That even with my ex, when I had the worst, when she left, it was after an episode of violence. So this individual started contemplating the link between, what their role was as a man and the impact that it had on not only themselves, but their partner and their related relationship. So this kind of ongoing perception that, or this experience, I should say, that violence simultaneously results in both benefit and harm contributes to tension for men. For most, the negative impacts of violence, however, outweighed the benefits as they discussed and thought about moving away from defining who they are as men in relation to violence. So as one person noted, I think maybe when we're younger and we're kids, adolescents, maybe we think, oh, if I was bigger and tougher, I'd be the best man because I could just beat everybody up. But as you get older, I think you kind of, for the most part, get away from that thinking and start to realize that maybe that's not what's important about being a man. So these contradictions and men's thoughts about, needing and feeling pressured to use violence while at the same time recognizing that it results in harm for themselves and others, results in some tensions. And these tensions are really what triggered men to think about the link between gender and violence, and that kind of tension and I guess that reality of the tension that exists when men are experiencing MV interconnectedness, we labeled as the paradox. And this to me is a really compelling quote. So this man says, I can specifically recall memories where the option of being aggressive was available, either by peer pressure or something like that. When you're supposed to stand up, get aggressive, insert yourself in there by threatening with violence, like a fight coming on or something like that. And me shying away from it because I didn't want to do that. And it conflicts so hard because you have an expectation to be that way, at least in a certain amount, like at the center of it, So it's difficult because you almost feel guilty. And there was another example where someone talked about like a fight emerging and feeling the need because some of his friends, and including a friend that identified as a woman, were kind of on the periphery of this, and he was concerned about their safety. And so feeling like on the one hand compelled to act, but not wanting to be involved in violence. So that's the pressure and the tension that we're talking about that exists for some men. Someone else says, I don't know, a part of me still thinks that the man should be that tough, stereotypical male sort of ideal, tough and quiet and hardworking, and the scrapper, the baller, that kind of thing. And it conflicts with this side of me that is very, like needs some human contact at some point. So again, you can see these tensions between what men conceptualize, or some men conceptualize as what it means to be a man, and the aspects of or the components of themselves that they want to express, but they don't feel are accepted or aligned with their views or the views of others. So ultimately, over time, as mentioned, when this tension arises and men begin to reflect on and contemplate it, they're able to see the impact that violence has had on their lives and their sense of self. And for many participants, they considered and began envisioning ways of being a man that did not involve violence. So one person said, for example, I kind of admire men who could stand their ground or be confident and not worry, like saying, I've got friends who aren't fighters, but they'll meet people and they'll get chatting about something and they'll actively disagree with them. I was always like, it amazed me people can do that. I'm not there yet. But this man is talking about, recognizing that other people can confront and resolve differences in ways that don't involve violence. So as men do grapple with this paradox and the ways that gender and violence have influenced their lives, they are better able to imagine how they might disconnect from violence. So this person says, the way I used to think being a man would be somebody that could punch everybody out and up and down the road, and everybody's scared of you, kind of running away from you. But now, I don't know. I look at being a man and violence, they shouldn't be together anymore anyway. Like, we're in a new millennium here. So even type of violence, it's not manly. So any type of violence is not manly. So again, you can see that there is this interest for men in separating their sense of self from, the use of violence in some contexts, but this is not straightforward. The paradoxical nature of men's desire to separate how violence defines their sense of self by being aware that violence and boy or manhood are tightly linked was revealed in continued descriptions of expectations for men to be strong, assertive, willing to protect, defend, and use violence. So these were revealed in descriptions like, I still am against violence or the use of violence overtly, but at the same time, violence is a part of being a man as well. Although most men had made the decision to eliminate violence from their lives in the context of this study, the individuals we spoke to, their past experiences of cumulative lifetime violence experience, as well as social expectations, made it really difficult to sever this connection. So I have just moved through to the implications aspect of this study. And I wanted to ask if, when you're listening to this, what do you think of the implications of a study like this and the findings that are presented are? And you can certainly just turn on your audio, or you may want to write something in the chat. Okay. So I'm going to move through and just talk a little bit about some of the implications. Oh, interesting work. Do you see a need to combine men's and women's experiences in your future studies? I think that. Okay, so I think that's a really great question about whether we see a need to combine men's and women's experiences in future studies. I do think that in our work, we've looked at women's experiences, and currently we're looking at experiences of individuals who identify as men. We are interested in, for example, I mentioned before that we're developing a measure of cumulative lifetime violence severity. And one of the things that we recognize is that that measure was developed and tested for use with men. One kind of reality that exists in the measurement of violence over time is that many of the violence measures have been developed for use with women. And often when they're, applied to other samples and individuals who identify in diverse ways, they're not really adjusted in ways that reflect variation in experiences of violence. So it may just be that pronouns are changed to direct it to a different target audience. So I do think we have to be thinking about the nuanced experience of individuals, gender diverse individuals, and we have been doing some of that work. Another example is that I've been involved in work to revise what's called the Composite Abuse Scale. This is a scale intended for use with women to measure their experiences of intimate partner violence. And our team worked with a broader national team to look at how we might adjust this measure to better reflect and capture men's experiences. And building on that work, we've since adjusted the measure further to look at ensuring that the measure is broad enough and appropriate reflects gender diversity in individuals that identify in diverse ways. So I guess a long-winded response to say that I do think we need to be looking not, sort of just solely at people who identify as women or people who identify as men, to moving towards a broader view of capturing experiences of violence based on experiences across diverse gender identities. In terms of Liz, thank you for your comment. You're saying, I think the paradox is really interesting to learn about. It will help to give me another perspective. Thank you. So what we have thought about in terms of study implications is that, the link between gender and violence really is not straightforward. So there are a lot of messages out there looking to, sort of end violence or prevent and disrupt violence. But I think unless we really begin to tackle how tightly linked violence is to expressions and constructions of gender for boys and men in our broader social context, and particularly in a Western context, it will be really just difficult to end experiences of violence and to really tackle that problem. This interconnectedness, I think we need to pay attention to the ways in which it offers reward or safety or status for boys and men, but also emphasize and focus on and communicate the harms that the interconnectedness results in as well. Because what we ultimately learned is that, over time with insight and varied experiences, individuals really understood and wanted to disconnect violence from how they define themselves as men based on the harm that they and others have experienced. The paradox is an important addition, I think, to the understanding of how men experience tension surrounding their desires and expectation to both, on the one hand, use violence, but also to reject it. And that pressure to use violence comes from anywhere and everywhere in their lives, from their family members, within their school environments, and so on. So these, this is a really important finding that we need to be thinking critically about and questioning, at the micro level in our own day-to-day interactions with individuals who identify as boys and men, and also in a broader way that I'll talk about in a moment. So many men do have this desire to reject the interconnectedness between gender and violence, but our social context and norms and expectations related to gender can make it really difficult to do this. Normalization and acceptance of violence then calls for leadership in efforts to counteract messages and pressures that boys and men receive that influence their behavior, and including and especially behaviors that involve use of violence. Critically examining and questioning structures of power that reinforce violence among men is important. And I think it's very important at this point in history. And we also need to redirect resources at addressing men's violence. So, I mentioned before that our team has a long-standing history and tradition of doing research with women focused in different areas of violence. And when we first started this turn towards looking at experiences of violence among individuals who identify as men, we recognized that there was some reluctance in the community among service providers and others. And it really was around, if we shift and focus our attention to men, will it somehow detract from the significant problem and reality that women, are most often targets of violence at the hands of men? And so that if, we're directing resources and money and research funding towards men, it may somehow detract from the women's agenda. But our team, I would say, passionately believes that, to really truly end that violence, knowing that men are often perpetrators of violence towards women, we do need to look at men's experience. And what we've learned in our examination of cumulative lifetime violence experience for men is that men have many experiences of violence across their lifetime, both as perpetrator and target, and they need help and support to confront and address the violence experience they've had. And we haven't talked about, but a significant proportion of our research has focused on the related health impacts for men. And we certainly do see that those with higher cumulative lifetime violence experience as target and or perpetrator does lead to increased risk for various health outcomes, including physical and mental health. So in this regard, we know that then it's important to direct resources for men. And we've heard from men when we talk to them in our interviews that they don't know where to go, and that when they look for information or resources and trying to understand and address their own violence experiences, they're very limited. So that is all I have for today. And I think I've left enough time for questions, which I understand we're supposed to leave some time. So we have about another 5 minutes. Anyone have any questions? Do you also work with youth populations in your research? So we have not yet. We've, to this point, focused on adult populations. And so, for example, with our measure of cumulative lifetime violence severity, we're examining and asking men to reflect on their lifetime experiences of violence. So they're, reflecting on and recalling childhood violence experiences based on their current context as men, or, living at the age of being an adult individual who identifies as being a man. So we haven't done that. It's more a retrospective or a reflection on their experiences in childhood.
Yes, thank you very much, Sue. You have actually been fielding questions and interacting throughout the presentation. I just want to remind everyone that this is a time where we can ask questions. You can raise your hand, you can chip in, or you can add your question to the chat. Do you do any international collaboration, or you're only working nationally in a Canadian context?
With this particular research so far, it has been a national context. So our research team for these studies looking at men's experiences have been all within the Atlantic region. Our team members are all here, but then our sample that we've collected for our subsequent studies, not this one, have included a national sample of men. But in terms of collaboration, our collaboration for these studies that we're citing today is just, the team within New Brunswick. We certainly do have good connections based on our other work with researchers and colleagues nationally at Western Ontario and UBC, especially for a lot of the women's work that has been done. Thank you for your questions. Liz says, no questions. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you, Liz. And, thanks to everyone who attended today. I know that the recording is available, and you can see as I move throughout the presentation, the research grants associated with the work that we're doing to look at men's experiences, as well as some of the research papers. So I'll just move through them here now so that you can reference them back in the recording.
Yes, thank you very much. The recording, as you mentioned, will be made available automatically to all those who have registered. If you receive the recording, please feel free to share the link within your networks. I also hope that you'll be joining future lunch and learns that CASN is offering, and please spread the word. I wish you all to have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, and thank you for the links. Maybe we should give people time to pick up those links that you've added.
They're in the presentation as well. So
Thank you. And thank you, Jordan, for all the behind the scenes work.